fake news, it's quite a broad definition, because one of the key things about human nature is that we tend to want to believe in our own ideas. So you have to really ask yourself, do I believe this because I just want to believe it? Or do I believe it because it's true? And that in itself can become a tool of manipulation. They call it the echo chamber effect now. Which didn't start with internet memes. You know, people have always been this way, but really the scholarly investigations into echo chamber effect came with right-wing radio in the US. It was ironically under the so-called Democrats, the Clinton Democrats, with the Communications Act, which liberalized radio ownership so that the right wing could really take off with their radio and create these kind of echo chambers with people like Rush Limbaugh and so on. And that had the effect of undermining the Democrats, because it gave support to the Republicans, where more people could hear the right wing radio and what they wanted to believe. And today we get that sort of thing with the internet memes, and it's certainly not just for the right wing. It's left or anything in between. It's one of the facets of human nature that can be manipulated, where you just go to the stories that you want to read.
And that's of course fueled quite a lot by algorithms, I'd imagine, right?
These days, absolutely. It's and very often some of the so-called followers on Twitter, whether it's the so-called liberal corporate media like the Washington Post or the so-called alt-right with President Trump, a lot of their followers are actually algorithms. They're not even real people. And some of the Pepe the Frog and so on, people, or what you thought were people logging on, were actually just algorithms. So in terms of following and artificially inflating people's viewing of news stories, you don't even know if the people looking at it or commenting are even real.
Sure. I mean, I think as well. I mean, it's like one thing that I've noticed is like there's a lot of talk about like Russian bots, etc. in the media at the moment. But it's like, I mean, what I find is it's twofold. Like, number one. Is that there'll be a lot of if I post something negative about Hillary Clinton, say, interesting that you mentioned the Clintons, like I will be bombarded with abuse, and a lot of these people are accounts that, a lot of it's like quite poorly written, and a lot of the accounts are like and it seems quite robotic, and like a lot of accounts have kind of virtually no followers, virtually never tweet unless it's to protect Hillary Clinton or something. That as an example. But also as well, like one thing I've noticed is just like it's just the readiness of people on Twitter just to block like anyone who says something that they don't like, and it's just hilarious. Like, I mean, there's not even abuse. Like someone was talking the other day about like, it was like a pro, like Mueller in the US. And I was like, and they were saying like, come on, Mueller, I can't wait until he gets Trump out of office. And I sent them a link to a Politico article about how Mueller was actually fighting to wrap up, and there won't be any more indictments, and his report will be secret and whatever. And just immediately blocked me. There was no editorializing for me. It just immediately blocked me.
Yeah, that's one of the other tools. See, fake news, whether it's from the bottom up with people who want to change the political system from the grassroots, or whether it's from the top down institutions. The fake news has many kind of weapons, and censorship is one of them. And today, particularly with corporate media, which it paradoxically has a massive public platform like social media, Twitter and Facebook and so on. When you enter into these social media, you are entering a private contract with a corporation, whether you like it or not. So therefore, in that sense, they have the right to do whatever they want, which includes blocking you, banning you for nothing. But on the other hand, they are purporting to be social platforms. So there should be some sort of democratic control over their ability to block you or ban you. This has been completely ignored at the moment by political class on both sides, the right and the left, because it serves an agenda. If people like whoever, including yourself, are blocked automatically from posting, then somebody, say if you make a complaint about that, one side or the other, the left wing or the right wing, could benefit. They could say, well, you know, you're whoever it is, they're posting offensive messages, so they should be banned. And then the other side could say, well, that's blocking your right to free speech. So that creates division and what's called the dialectic. So in that way, both sides have ended up sowing division over something which people should really be having sensible discussions about. So the fake news, it's not only a problem with human nature that we only see what we want to see, and we're often not honest enough to accept when we've been wrong about something, or to
indeed
evidence subjectively.
Recognise confirmation bias and stuff.
That's right, yeah. We're also very prone to tribalism. So if one side says something we don't like, we tend to immediately go to the side where we support or feel protected, rather than saying, well, wait a minute, maybe there's an argument to be made for both sides, or maybe that whatever has been said, people find it offensive, so it could have been expressed a bit more sympathetically, but it should not be banned because that inhibits free speech. There's no sort of middle ground. It's either black or white, left or right. And today with, as I say, with the massive corporate control, I mean, these so-called social media sites, they're kind of faceless corporations. When you write to them with a complaint or a query, it's very often an algorithm that writes to you. It's not as if there's a guy at a desk that you can telephone and have a conversation with. So you don't even know half the time who you're talking to when you try and interact with these organizations. And that's a very powerful tool of social control for either side, whichever political entity is in power.
Sure. And so, I mean, I guess, this is probably a question I should have asked first, but what inspired you to write the book?
It was the talk about fake news, because I thought when Trump came along and everybody was screaming about fake news, Trump accused the mainstream of being fake and the mainstream accused Trump of being fake. I thought, well, hang on, we've always had fake news. This is the nature of power, and the mainstream media, whether it's state or corporate, have been the biggest purveyors of fake news. I mean, you know, all this rumors about Russian troll farms or whatever. It's the kind of paradigm that the mainstream try and keep the population in terms of their fake news. They just eclipse all the other stuff that they're complaining about. So I looked into, first of all, asked the question, what is fake news? And as I mentioned, it's the problem partly with human nature, with our biases, but also our inability to accept when we've been wrong. That's key to manipulate. It's also raises the deeper question of what is real and what is truth, because it's very hard to prove absolutes. And again, that can become a tool of manipulation, because if you can't prove something like an equation, I mean, you can in maths or physics, for example, but in social sciences, it's much harder to prove something. So in that way, fake news can be, it can range from the absurd to the subtle and everything in between. So I started looking at some, to sort of prove the case, I sort of looked at some historical examples and thought, well, people in power want to maintain and expand their power wherever they can. That's their agenda. And so one of the ways in which they do that is to keep the population in a kind of psychological prison or an intellectual prison, where whatever criteria they set has to be the ultimate truth, even if looking at it objectively it's complete rubbish. So the Babylonian rulers, for example, thousands of years ago, claimed that they were descended from gods. So
that's quite
really
common,
argue with them.
Quite a common claim amongst ruling elites.
Yeah, the divine right of kings and so on.
Yeah,
that's right. And to codify that into law as well, and say that you have to do as we say because we're from the gods. Whether it was in ancient Greece, it was Plato with the noble lie, that we have to lie to the population for their own good, not just for our own good, the elites, but the public need to be lied to and in a sense want to be lied to. And this theme it continues right to the present. So the WikiLeaks cables and emails showed that some of the Democratic planners for Hillary Clinton were saying exactly the same sort of thing, that we can't tell the ultimate truth to the public about Hillary Clinton's connections to Wall Street, for example, because it's just not good for them to know. So we've got to keep that a secret and so on. So it's just part of the nature of power to use information as a weapon. And this is quite, at least in the UK, it's quite astonishing what's acknowledged in public documents, which is another aspect of fake news, the omission of other parts of news to create a news framework in which other forms of news are omitted. So the British Ministry of Defence, for example, regularly publishes projections of how it envisages the world is going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And they say in some of those projections that media is one of the keys to shaping public perceptions, which means keeping people in the paradigm, the social conditions in which elites want them to be kept. And it also talks in there about the various uses of information as a kind of weapon against the public. And so they quite acknowledge quite openly that information is power. And as an organisation that's part of the state that wants to maintain and expand its power, it's therefore important, from their point of view, to present what they call news, which is information that's going to benefit them in their position of power. And there are plenty of cases, whether it was the classic one now is the weapons of mass destruction lie about Iraq, but it's not just limited to that. It was when Britain, France, the US wanted to bomb Libya in 2011, they came up with fake news about Gaddafi going to go on a rampage and just any kind of nonsense to use as a way of justifying their policy. And I was talking earlier about the sort of foibles of human nature. One of the problems is people are very easily made to feel guilty, and the elites know this perfectly well. So they've written books about the sensitivities of the public to foreign policy and so on, and they say that we could we could sort of justify our foreign policy by making the public feel guilty about things, which is what humanitarian intervention is all about.
Oh yeah, completely. But it's like this is the thing as well. As changing what you're talking about Plato, but I do think that there's in every era, modern and historic, there's always this vast intellectualizing, or maybe you call it intellectual artifice, which is basically structured around, basically telling you that what your rulers are doing, or a particular aspect of society which is actually terrible, is really, kind of not only morally justified, but morally necessary. And that humanitarian intervention fits so easily within that that model, that historical example, and yet people still believe it. And it's shocking to me when you hear all these people coming out with all of these kind of very kind of privileging, but also kind of almost guilty, we're letting Assad get away with this. When if you as if you think about the amount of assumptions in there that say the West has a right to stop him doing what he's doing, that we know what he's doing, that we know the reasons why, that it's being done for good reasons, that it will have a good, that bombing Syria will have a good, positive impact. There is this huge amount of I guess we call them implications to that view, and it's just and which obviously serves an elite purpose. And to hear kind of average people kind of coming out with the stuff that they've heard on the TV is just really, it's genuinely frightening to me.
Yeah, that's part of the problem with human nature, which is exploitable. That if you hear about atrocities, they don't even have to be real. It's called atrocity propaganda in scholarship. If you hear atrocity stories, it's a natural human instinct, first of all, to think, oh, that's terrible, we have to do something about it.
It's funny they talk about how human beings are naturally selfish, isn't it?
Well, they can. I mean, when it comes to the economy, they can say, "Well, we're naturally selfish, so all for yourself." But when it comes to what they call humanitarian intervention, they say, "Well, we all care about other people, so we have to do something." That's another part about fake news, is the selectivity of whatever they want to portray. It's it's very isolated in time to whatever agenda they're trying to push.
Yeah.
So with the case of the general public, it's fairly easy to manipulate people's sense of guilt because, for one thing, it's the structure of the media. They give you very brief stories with what's called, in logic, the appeal to authority. It's actually a fallacy. So something's right because an authority figure is saying it. So it's somebody, a defense expert, quote unquote, who happens to be part of the ruling class. And the state media, they present to you a short frame of just a 5 minutes or even less clip of whoever, Assad, allegedly committing some atrocity, and all the context of international law, of critical evaluations, of other voices like, say, Robert Fisk, the reporter who actually goes to these places and investigates on the ground.
Patrick Corbyn as well. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty much excluded from this narrative.
Yeah.
And
as is, what's his name? Is it Peter Ford, who's the former ambassador to Syria?
Yeah, well, they have made a mistake of including him on the show a couple of times on the BBC.
Yeah, and then they
he's
quickly
just demolished their narrative.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is fantastic. So, okay, I mean, what are some other kind of key examples? I mean, like, obviously, there are the obvious ones of weapons of mass destruction in Syria, etc.
That's right. One case that I mean, these are structural problems. Like I mentioned, there's the fact that there's state media. So whatever you get from the BBC is just the British state. It's not going to be the truth, whatever that means. It's going to be what the state wants to hear and what the state wants you to believe. Then there's the corporate media. I mean, according to European standards, we've got the most right-wing corporate media in Europe. So whatever agenda you get there, it's going to be promoting what they call TINA. There is no alternative. There is no alternative to this economic program called neoliberalism and privatization and cut back on social security. And whenever you get somebody like Corbyn coming along, who represents quite a significant, large portion of grassroots interests from teachers and firefighters and people on low pay, they're going to go into overdrive to slander him as dangerous, an idiot, a Marxist. One of the funniest things I saw was a headline in the Express which said, Corbyn sparks horror at plan to turn Britain into North Korea. That was the headline, and there was like nothing in there about North Korea. It was a joke. But that's an extreme example. But then you've got more subtle examples from even the corporate so-called left-wing media, like The Guardian. They've not been much better in trying to marginalise Corbyn. So these are.
I'd say that they were actually worse, just purely by token of the fact that, they actually have. They have a. I mean, it's a common criticism of the liberal media by people like Chris Hedges and Chomsky. But it's like that. Liberals are typically the people who should be out there organising and protesting and whatever. And then, so what the liberal media serves to do is ensure those people don't do that. And actually support foreign intervention and dislike Corbyn and like all of this stuff. I think that there was a really interesting kind of reverse ferret by The Guardian where it was probably best encapsulated by Polly Toynbee, who'd spent kind of even when on the campaign trail she refused to mention him and said, oh, he's not a serious candidate and all of this stuff. And then the second that he did well, suddenly it was like, oh shit, actually people do like him, and so they then had to keep up the pretense of pluralism and kind of progressive values. They suddenly became rampant like Corbynistas for a few weeks. It was really bizarre.
Yeah, and that's just a reflection of going with the trend or wherever power lies. If they think that the tide is going to turn in one direction, it's part of the agenda to go that way. But with regard to marginalising Corbyn, which really means a large section of the public that supports him. He's just a figurehead, really, Corbyn. That's part of the left-right dialectic that I was talking about earlier. And in that way, I agree that the liberal media are worse, because at least with the overtly right-wing media, you know what you're getting. But if you think you're going to get something a bit more intelligent or progressive with The Guardian, then it's easier to manipulate and to marginalise figures who are not even that radical. I mean, all Corbyn is proposing is what about 70% of the public want, which is renationalisation of many of the industries, a national investment fund, having a less violent foreign policy, reconfiguring the Navy to do more genuine humanitarian work like search and rescue missions rather than bombing missions. If you look at the polls, that's what most people want. So it's not exactly a radical agenda, but that's been part of the response to this public movement. So these are structural problems. Then you asked about specific examples. There was a case quite recently where Corbyn was interviewed by Andrew Neil on the BBC.
Oh God, yes.
And Andrew Neil was talking about ISIS, and he actually quoted from an alleged ISIS edition of their magazine Dabiq, which said, we'll hate you and continue to bomb you anyway because you don't accept Islam. Well, actually, that issue of Dabiq number 15 was exposed on online media. I think it was Vice, a reporter for Vice, exposed that edition as a fraud. ISIS had actually issued a statement saying, do not read this issue because we never wrote it. And yet Andrew Neil goes on BBC quoting it as if it's real. And Andrew Neil also claimed, really ridiculously, that Islamic State existed before the invasion of Iraq. Well, where's he getting that from? That's what the Wikipedia entry says, right? So I emailed Andrew Neil, where did you get this information from? He never replied, obviously, if you would expect him to. I then filed a Freedom of Information request to say, where did you get this source for these absurd claims? And I had a letter back from the BBC saying, because we're a news service, we're not obliged to reveal where we got this information. So that means they have legal protection to spread fake news.
Well, it's like, I mean, I've got to say that, I mean, again, sorry to interrupt you, but it's like, it's one of the things that I found really interesting is that, like, it was, I mean, obviously there are a number of journalists who are up to their eyeballs in the security services. And I think, like, historically, I think my friend Robin Ramsey of Lobster Magazine's documented this thing, is like, historically, the Times is in bed with MI6, and the Telegraph is much more in bed with MI5, but they essentially the BBC as well, and it's like you have a guy called Mark Urban, who was has a rather kind of shady background in respect of there are huge gaps in his CV, was in the same kind of tank regiment as a number of spies, including Pablo Miller, who was Skripal's recruiter. And frequently kind of publishes articles based on, someone told me anonymously, blah, blah, blah. And it was funny as well, because can you imagine, like, if there was someone who worked for Russia Today who had who'd had a background and was involved, in potentially in intelligence, knew lots of intelligence people, and was regurgitating what they told them, the uproar, etc. And I went along to his book launch of the Skripal files, and I asked him some rather pointed questions, because the whole thing had been a kind of fairly typical establishmenty, softball interview of why is your book so brilliant? Do you fear for your life now that you've written it? This is nonsense. But Luke Harding, who again is up to his nuts in the security services, and someone who I've had a lot of crosswords with, and someone who's just publishes outright lies, because without any editorializing or criticism that are fed to him by the security services. and he was so. I asked him politely, and I was asking what I thought were constructive questions. He got so angry and was just, you could see that he was seething, and he was so angry that someone was actually questioning him on actually asking him remotely tough questions about this book that's sold as the definitive book on the Skripal affair, but can't answer key central questions, and a lot of it is based on off the record briefings from people in the intelligence services. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like it's worrying. Like,
well, yeah, as you say, if that was Russia Today or whatever, we'd laugh if we were sold stories based on that. But that's again part of our own. It's this tribalism that because it's us and because just the phrase security service, we assume that they're interested in our security, so therefore they have some sort of right to be there, or that they're genuinely interested in protecting us. And I'm sure that's partly what they do, but that's not their main agenda.
No.
It's a very establishment. These MI5, MI6, first of all, they come out of the military, military intelligence, Section 5, Section 6, so they're part of the state. They're also, it's part of the upper echelons of the state. A lot of the people involved are Oxford, Cambridge types.
Yes.
And so they protect what's called the national interest. But the national interest doesn't mean the interest of ordinary people. It's not in the national interest for us to be provoking states that have nuclear weapons. That could destroy us all quite by accident, not even in a war. If there was ever a miscalculation.
Which there have been many so far,
Absolutely. And furthermore, they know this, because in the kind of Ministry of Defence projections that I mentioned earlier, they even say so, that this is an extremely precarious situation. So the real national interest is to de-escalate. So in that way, people like Corbyn would be in the national interest if he follows through on his promises. But what they regard as the real national interest to them is the keeping themselves in this position of power and also supporting large corporations, whether it's the banks or the oil companies. And so their policy is very much designed for that. And as I mentioned earlier, the media and information system being one of the pillars of their social control, of course they have to infiltrate that. So you have the structural issue of the BBC being state media, other media being corporate. Then you've got they're seeded with intelligence agents. That has a history. So,
such as, I have probably a pretty good idea, but just for the sake of the article.
Yeah, so World War II, for example, and it continued after World War II, as far as we know, for decades after World War II, where MI5 would start to vet people who applied for jobs in the BBC.
I've written about that before,
Yeah. So if they were associated with what was called communism, which could just mean a left-wing political group, or anything that really challenged the state, they were very unlikely to get the job. So therefore, at the bottom level, people like that were rooted out. So of course, the whole picture that's presented to the public is going to be one of elite interests.
Yeah. Also, as well, I'm sure that you've read about it. You've got IRD, which was a dedicated fake news factory set up by the British government. Like,
hello.
Yeah, sorry. You've got the example of IRD in the 70s. We got shut down in the 70s, but which was dedicated to the dissemination of false information.
No, I don't know about that.
You don't know our Information Research Department?
Oh, this came out of the Second World War.
Yeah, well, it was set up. It was set up afterwards, and essentially, there's a really good book on this called Disrupt and Deny, which bizarrely is written by this guy who goes through all the official files and somehow I think he's quite an establishment kind of academic, and he just doesn't. He kind of he almost without kind of any kind of he doesn't really draw any conclusions from any of it, and it's just really weird. When he's writing about how the IRD basically precipitated a massacre in Indonesia because they deliberately spread false information about communist massacres through the international media, which were meant to in order that the Indonesian military had an opportunity to, had a pretext for cracking down incredibly violently on them, and led to the deaths of millions of people potentially, or however many. I mean, one would be too many, but it's like, and he just doesn't seem to. He just kind of views this as like a strategy. He's just like, oh well, it was the policy of the time.
I think I know the book you're referring to. It's I think that came in out of the context of the Second World War, and they kept it going rather like the vetting system under the pretext of counter-communism, when in fact it was just a department for disseminating fake news about what they call counterinsurgency operations, like in Indonesia. I've gotten the Paul. Somebody, is it?
I've got it knocking around the room. Hang on. Yes, we're Rory Cormac.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's written a recent book, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sorry. Anyway, you were saying.
So there's a history of the so-called security services or intelligence services seeding the media with agents of influence to, if not spread outright lies, although they certainly do that sometimes, it's also to skew the picture in ways favourable to the particular interests of the state.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, and so I mean, like do you have any views on Russiagate?
Is this the hacking? Or?
No, and like all of the media focus on that, which is
it's just part of the what's called the new Cold War. It's there's no there is depending on the issue, there's either no evidence or there's very little facts or evidence presented. So you've got the Steele report, which is just, I don't think anybody takes that seriously, other than and also people that want to believe it. Maybe they want to believe that Putin is a demon or something. And then you've got the hacking that did Russia try and influence the US elections. We had claims from the media that the heads of various intelligence agencies thought so, but when you actually review the published documents, like the Senate documents that came out, there's very little or no evidence presented, and it's also a massive diversion, because the US population should be far more concerned about multi-millionaires and billionaires like Robert Mercer and massive corporations that were funding. I mean, the Trump campaign was funded by hedge funds largely, like Mercer. The Clinton campaign was funded by the usual sort of corporations. These are the people So these are the people and the corporations that invest in politics in order to set policy. So these are the people disrupting American democracy. And when the grassroots did have a chance to get a kind of progressive figure, at least as far as the spectrum goes today, in the form of Bernie Sanders, who is a hawk on foreign policy, by the way, but at least on domestic issues. He's
very pro-Israel, yes, interesting that, isn't it?
So the Democrats went, into overdrive to try and disrupt his campaign. So these are just examples of the kinds of influence that large corporations and the Democratic establishment in the US, the Democratic Party, that they have in preventing democracy. So if you can blame somebody else for that and say it's Russia, that's all very well. But the other function it serves, as I said, is to stoke this new Cold War. And it's for the few years around the time of Yeltsin, there was privatization in Russia. So the United States had some market access to Russia, and this is what US corporations wanted. Then with Putin's nationalization, suddenly these opportunities for the US to exploit the Russian economy were closed or hampered. And what's interesting about that is US military documents, and I cite them because the military are the people that plan for war and are working on behalf of operations. They state in the Strategic Services Institute, for example, that the real threat from Russia is nationalism and nationalization of industry, which means not honoring contracts as the US sees it for US corporations. So it's closing a market to
US exploitation,
which wants to which actually formally is committed to running the world. They call it full spectrum dominance.
Yeah.
So this is the real
space next day.
Well, yeah, they already are.
Yeah.
So this is the US. This is the elite US agenda, and this is the real reason why the US establishment does not like Russia. And you cannot say to the public, Putin's a demon because he's not doing what we say. That's not going to go down well with the American public. So you have to spread all sorts of propaganda, and some of it's true, some of it's absolutely not true. There's all sorts of things in between. And this creates a picture of a dangerous world, so we have to back out of nuclear weapons treaties. We have to expand the so-called missile defense system, which is a real threat to Russia. And this, in terms of fake news, it's, as I say, there's some outlandish propaganda like the Steele report, but there's also, more importantly than that, the omission of other evidence, like the kind of documents I mentioned, which talk about Russia being, closing its markets to US exploitation. So it's creating a false picture of a dangerous Russia that's trying to take over the world and disrupt US elections, and that's part of the key agenda of the fake news in that context. Yeah,
sure. And so, I mean, what would you how would you reform the media, or at least kind of media sources such as Facebook, in order to ensure that that this can't happen, or is it impossible?
I think it certainly requires more democratic input into the media. So there are groups like the Glasgow University Media Group, which have their bad news series. They've started off, I think, with Israel and the lies that are told about Israel.
I think it was refugees, but then Israel's a big one,
Yeah, that kind of thing. There's also Media Lens, Cromwell and Edwards Media Lens Group. People can support those kind of organisations, which are giving them not only alternative information, but also the kind of information that's simply omitted. There's also, people need to question themselves. I started by saying that it's very human to be biased towards things you want to believe rather than things that are actually true. So people can question their own beliefs. Does this information conform to my belief? If not, I should change my belief, not try and ignore the information. And it's a question of really democratizing the media, which could have been done via social media, but now, as we mentioned earlier, with the kind of algorithms that are being used and the massive funding on both sides, the elite left and the elite right, for their own agendas, those opportunities are becoming more narrow. So now you've got so-called self-appointed fact-checking websites like Snopes, which have a clearly liberal agenda, but within limits. So some of the stuff they've got on Iran, for example, they don't tell you that the United States has got no business to impose any kind of conditions on Iran for this nuclear deal, because under, I think it's Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran does have a right to develop nuclear energy for civilian use. Multiple UN inspector reports have said that Iran is not developing nuclear weapons. Well, the entry on Snopes just ignores all of that sort of thing, and gives you the impression that it's okay to bully and sanction and intimidate Iran. So that's the liberal side. Then you've got, on the right wing, you've got I mentioned Robert Mercer. He's actually been traced to setting up the so-called alt-right through Steve Bannon and people like that. So none of this, whether it's an elite left-wing or an elite right-wing agenda, none of it coming from the grassroots. It's not. None of it's in the interest of ordinary people. So,
well, so you've got the Atlantic Council partnering with Facebook now as well, which is like just absolutely terrifying, given that their board of directors or whatever is like a who's who of like absolutely appalling kind of neocons with who have had close involvement in some of America's worst from recent foreign policy decisions, but also is funded by NATO and the Gulf states.
Yeah, and it's also worth remembering that during the Arab Spring, even before then, the United States, the State Department were training revolutionaries to use social media, including Facebook and Twitter, to try and overthrow selected governments. So the US wanted Assad, Gaddafi, and Mubarak gone because they weren't following orders. But they wanted to keep the army in Egypt. That's the crucial thing, and they wanted to impose these, Islamic jihadi lunatics who they call moderate rebels in Libya and in Syria. So they also have been quite clearly weaponizing. That's a term the elites like to use, but it's in fact they have been weaponizing social media in other countries to use as weapons against selected elites that they don't want in power. If you compare that to, say, Saudi Arabia, generally they want the elites in Saudi Arabia kept, and so there were no Facebook and Twitter revolutions in Saudi Arabia. The US and Britain made sure that the Arab Spring was not going to even take off, let alone be successful there. Whereas in a country whose regime they wanted to overthrow, they would use these social media. And even in Cuba, the CIA went so far as to set up a Twitter-esque. Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's amazing, isn't it? But we could talk about. Obviously, we talked about kind of how you would and could reform this, but. Do you think there's any chance of that happening?
Yeah, people also have to be aware that what's happening now with what they thought was going to be their social media it's not their social media. These are corporations. They're being exploited by the elites on both sides. So there can be new forms of media being developed by ordinary people who have got no interest in whether it's the Clinton elites or the Trump elites. People who have got no interest in either could find ways to overcome this. But one of the things I should point out is that a lot of people say, well, with the rise of the internet and independent blogging and so on, the elite media are falling to pieces. But if you look at the actual statistics of who visits what site, yes, in like the New York Times, their print revenue is down, but they're still one of the most popular news sites. If you look at the the ranking